What happened universally was that the state took the place of the church as a visible entity. When Catholics came to this country, they discovered a system in which the public schools were Protestant.
At the Council of Baltimore, it was determined, the bishops decided that every parish in the whole country had to provide for the free Catholic education of every child in their parish.
In those days, it was a marvelous combination of grassroots popular participation with the direction of the hierarchy. It was like a perfect Catholic thing. You know, the hierarchy were doing exactly what their job was, and the faithful were eager to be able to do their job in educating their children in the true faith, and it all worked together.
All together.
Yeah.
That worked more or less until basically 1960 or so. So, Father Hugh, today, let's speak a little bit in a big picture way about the history of Catholic education, where the education of young people has factored so prominently in our holy religion. And maybe we begin with monastic schools in the Middle Ages, or maybe we begin with what happened in the French Revolution, and which was such a cultural change. What do you think? Where shall we begin, Father?
Well, right there, as you mentioned. Okay, so Catholic education in Europe, which of course is the place where Catholic education first developed in terms of its canons and practices and methods, coming out of the education of the ancient Greco-Roman world and the classical ideals and literature and approach to math and science that were prevalent in those times. Little change from late antiquity, late classical period through the Middle Ages in terms of what a basic education consisted of. Change began at the time of the French Revolution, or the Age of Enlightenment, as it's sometimes called, which is a highly suspect term, which I don't recommend. If you notice, when they call it the Middle Ages, it's between two things.
Right.
That's supposed to be between classical antiquity and, of course, wonderful modern Enlightenment, as though the entire culture that developed there throughout the Catholic part of the history, where it all kind of germinated and developed and slowly became a thing, which is called Europe, Christian civilization, Christendom, all of that. That's just middle, between pagan civilization on one side and post-Christian or anti-Christian or anti-Catholic civilization on the other. So the system of education it really wasn't changed by the Reformation so much. The basic education of a young person in those days would have been similar in a Catholic or in a Protestant country, except for the Catholic country to be taught Orthodox Christianity, and in a Protestant one, they'd be taught the new novel heresies that were establishing new religions in Europe. But so at the time of the French Revolution, which was a true revolution in which there was an attempt to undermine and replace all the most fundamental institutions of society. Very different from the American Revolution, which was a taxpayers' revolt and was not as radical in its call for replacement of institutions. The French Revolution had to be, you could see historically, had to be much more radical and also therefore much more violent.
Yes.
Because it had to accomplish the ends of the Protestant Reformation and also the ends of a political revolution all at the same time.
Right. So they had to behead the monarchs and the bishops.
Right. And then make throne and altar had to go, Right. And so they enthroned the goddess of reason, the altar of Notre Dame, and all these horrible things. But in any case, it was much more radical and violent. And so typically in Latin countries where the Catholic Church retained her status or her predominance, in any case, the revolutions have always been more bloody because they had more to do. Right. And they had to be more ruthless about it. And so, say, for example, in Spain or in Mexico, we see the horrible effects of that same mentality continued throughout history, the same program, practically speaking.
So, Father Hugh, you mentioned two important ideas that overturned Christendom. First, you mentioned the Enlightenment.
Attempted to overturn.
Exactly, important. You mentioned Enlightenment and how that's a ill-chosen word, but certainly there must be some ideas there that were revolutionary in a sense in the spirit of the Enlightenment. What happened there intellectually or culturally that was so overturning of what had come before?
Well, there's first of all there's a kind of ideological discrediting of traditional science in the discovery of the actual arrangement of the solar system, for example. And that called into question then everything that had been taught from traditional science, taken from Aristotle all the way along, commented on as authoritative, was unquestionable. And then, of course, that naturally leads to a discussion of, well, what are we doing when we're educating young men also? And so what came to the fore was a critical approach to the history of thought. Protestantism has prepared the way for that very well because it called the question on everything that Christendom had tried to accomplish from the late Roman Empire on, including the empire's interest in the state of the church. It begins with Constantine, and the Protestants fell on various sides of that. Some were for the state's involvement with the church, others completely opposed to it. But it was all made very unstable.
Everything's up for grabs.
Right, up for grabs. And and therefore also with you have a different religion taught. We have a Catholic version of Christianity and we have various Protestant versions. And so there's a great instability in thought. And so seeking for a kind of teaching authority that would be stable, that was not ancient science or philosophical authority like Aristotle, and looking for a model that would provide opportunities for progress in thinking. They had a sort of aha when they looked at the Italian Renaissance. They said, oh, well, we could sort of do that. A lot of things came to the fore which were not emphasized in the Middle Ages, and yet, of course, they were not discontinuous with the Middle Ages by any means, but they saw their little wedge, something new. That's why we call it a Renaissance, a rebirth of what? Well, what they saw was a rebirth of the ideals of classical pagan culture.
Yes.
And therefore, okay, we can do Aristotle and we can do Plato, but now denuded of their associations with Christian theology and their use in Christian theology, and they just become simpler secular schools of thought that are somewhat competitive. You have the Aristotelians in Padua who wanted pure science, and the Platonists of Florence who wanted metaphysical speculation, and you get all of that in the Renaissance, which prepares the way, given the possibilities of new science, especially in astronomy, providing the way for just a general attitude towards the tradition of human thought that allowed for a maximum degree of liberty of discussion and investigation.
Yes.
And so the idea of intellectual freedom came to the fore, and that should be protected at all costs against the intrusions of the state and of the church, who both become enemies of free thinking.
Free thought, right.
And along with that, your parents, insofar as they represent those traditional sources,
yes,
patriotism and Orthodox religion.
So, Father Hugh, with that understanding of what happened in the Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment, and the revolutions that came from it, or the sort of full flowering of it, or the full rotting of it, we might say,
growth.
How does that link to what happens in education then? And then specifically how that trickles down into Catholic education.
So what happened was then the traditional education available to young people from monastery schools, even from the Jesuits, for example, or in France, the French Oratorians.
Yes.
Those sources of education were eliminated.
Yes.
And with nothing immediately to replace them.
Just let me interrupt just for a moment, Father Hugh, for a bit of a clarification for our viewers and listeners, that you said monastery schools, that would include even our tradition as canons regular.
Right,
so
right, of course.
Abbeys, monasteries, where families, especially in the time of our order's roots, principally elite families would send their sons to the school, to the monastery, where they would live and be educated in this continuous tradition from the classical period, as you indicated.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned the Jesuits, and so those clerks regular, sort of that 16th century kind of priestly religious life was not so much associated with a monastery, but still educating young people. Is
Yes,
that right?
right. More or less. Yeah, that's the idea. Of course, children were always educated on the level of catechism and so on, but in terms of actual education, in terms of literacy and all those things, that was a specialty.
Liberal arts, yes,
a specialty.
Okay.
So at the time of the French Revolution, then the monasteries were suppressed and emptied, despoiled of their properties, very little of which was ever recovered. If you count the number of Benedictine and canon regular communities in France that actually inhabit an ancient spot from the hundreds of monasteries that existed before the Revolution, you'll find very few, maybe about 15, 20 at the most.
There are only 2 of our order,
An
for
order,
example,
there are 2 left.
reopened.
Yeah.
2 left.
Right.
Reopened after the Revolution. And I think there were, how many hundreds before?
It was in France. It was more like 93, something like that. Anyway,
nearly
they were
100.
a good number. In any case, those institutions of learning were no longer accessible because they no longer existed. So the local bishops, when they finally got out from under the Napoleonic control of the church, they were faced with the difficulty of providing for Catholic education without those institutions. And so what happened was that zealous diocesan clergy, first among which bishops, also zealous religious clergy who saw the need and assisted the bishops, they established new congregations of teaching sisters and also of teaching brothers as well, Christian schools and so on, who specialized in educating ordinary kids and not just the elites. So Christian brothers are where ordinary kids went, and the Jesuits were where the more wealthy kids went. But they established these new congregations, which were set to provide education in a way that had never been before. Actually, they were organized newly. They were a novelty. Actually, we tend to think of the Catholic Church, say before Vatican II, as always having had these ranks of habited religious sisters going around everywhere educating people. Well, it wasn't really the case.
That was an answer to a problem.
It was an answer to a problem which was solved locally by the bishops. And so that's why we have this explosion of congregations of religious women. So how many Sisters of St. Joseph are there? Well, there's original congregations. So many divided up into various ways.
Or Sisters of Mercy or the
Sisters
Sacred
Mercy, right, exactly.
It's just so many.
Yeah, Mercy and St. Joseph might be the 2 biggest. But they then accompanied the enormous number of immigrants who came to the New World and provided the parochial schools and the Catholic school system in assistance of the bishops, always with the bishops who were very much like founders. They were the founders of religious education in this country as is appropriate. And so they accompanied the immigrants and provided a system of Catholic education.
Yes. So we find ourselves in the New World, in North America,
right?
In our country, in the United States. We find ourselves at the end of the 19th century, mid to late 19th century, with these waves of Catholic European immigrants coming into the country, accompanied by congregations of religious sisters, or with new congregations of religious sisters founded in the New World,
for example, like St. Elizabeth Seton and
St. Elizabeth Seton, right, or the Sisters of Loretto at the Foot of the Cross in Kentucky, so many others, and so
Mother Cabrini,
right. So the bishops of our country in the 19th century, providing for the education of the children in their parishes, with these ranks of wonderful, generous teaching sisters. Yeah. So many. Now, Father Hugh, why wouldn't they have just sent the Catholic students to the public schools?
Well, you consider that although there's so-called separation of church and state in the American system, the fact is that in Protestant religion, a certain segment of which denies the essentially visible nature of the church and holds only to an invisible church of the elect, of the saved, and the visible church is just a necessary instrument, but not part of the essence of the church. What happened universally was that the state took the place of the church as a visible entity, also guaranteed by God, which must be obeyed, and so on. And so the sort of magisterial governing role of the state took the place of the church's proper role in areas that regard morality and education. And so when Catholics came to this country, they discovered a system in which the public schools were Protestant. People forget they were not secular, they were Protestant. You can see this very easily. Just examine report cards from public schools, and you'll see the Bible class in every single one of them. You know, that was a class that was taught everywhere. And so Catholics had to provide for a Catholic education in a country where the public free education, which was supported by taxes, was promoted Protestantism.
And was often quite anti-Catholic in certain parts
Could
of
be
the
in
country.
locations, in certain areas. Well, that was, But then, of course, there were efforts to deal with that system on the part of the Catholics, getting the government to go along. And so they would sometimes give release time so the Catholic kids didn't have to go to the Protestant instruction, but could go to their own catechism classes, which were for the public school students. So like the CCD classes, they were originally for public school students, Catholics who were given time out to go, which is a clear recognition on the part of the state schools that, no, we're Protestants, so you need to go somewhere else.
So the Catholic kids would step out of class for the Bible class or for the Protestant religious instruction and go to the Congregation for Christian Doctrine.
Right, the CCD.
CCD.
That was one system, but so Catholics found a system in which the state schools, which would have been most convenient and which would have been the equivalent of the Catholic schools in some place like Bavaria, were not available. And so we had to have our own. The bishops saw to that, and these congregations of religious sisters were founded to provide that very thing. First in France, mostly, and in the areas affected by the French Revolution, most profoundly into Western Germany and other areas. And they came over to the States to accomplish the very same thing.
Yes. There was also then, Father Hugh, I just want to interrupt again, if you don't mind, the Council of Baltimore, and the bishops were really serious they were so serious about the education, the proper Catholic education of the children, that every parish at the Council of Baltimore, it was determined, the bishops decided that every parish in the whole country had to provide for the free Catholic education of every child in their parish.
Yeah.
And so, of course, that meant that most parishes opened their own elementary school using the resource of the teaching sisters as a inexpensive way to educate those children, because, of course, the sisters had a convent at the parish where the parish fed them, housed them, and allowed them to teach in the parish school, elementary school, and high school sometimes also. But the fact was that this was determined by the church herself in our country, that free education for every Catholic child. And if you couldn't do it in your own parish, then they had to provide for that in the neighboring parish.
Yeah. That's the great work of the American bishops in the 19th century, was the work of Catholic education.
Right.
And they were faithful to their office and behaved in a way which is magisterial and pontifical. I mean, they really knew how to govern the church, shepherd the church, and that was one of the principal ways in which they did it. There's no doubt about it.
Yes.
And it also meant that the parents had the obligation to send their children to a Catholic school.
Yes.
They were not free, unless they had no other alternatives, to send their children to public school.
In fact, they were forbidden to do so. Unless they had
The
no other
local
option.
bishops would even excommunicate people that didn't send their kids to Catholic school.
That's right.
But there was not the excuse of finances, economic issues, because the school was free to those who needed it.
That's right, yes.
And I remember parishes took up regular collections for the support of the school. Everyone was expected to support the school, even if they didn't have children in it.
Yes.
There was a very strong sense that this was the obligation not only of families, but also of the community.
Just a little anecdote, and this comes even from my own childhood, and you still see it a little bit in some parishes where the envelopes for your Sunday offering were numbered and with your family name on them, and you were given the whole box for the whole year of 52 envelopes for every Sunday.
They kept
track because they had to be sure that if your children were going to go to the parish school, you had to demonstrate that you were a Catholic in good standing who was frequenting the sacraments, and in other words, donating to the parish with your financial resources with the Sunday offering to offset the cost of educating your children.
Yeah.
And so that the whole parish envelope thing was all about this, so that the parish school and the pastor would know who's coming to mass regularly, and are their children able to be educated in our parish school.
And it shows that in those days it was a marvelous combination of grassroots popular participation with the direction of the hierarchy. It was like a perfect Catholic thing. The hierarchy were doing exactly what their job was, and the faithful were eager to be able to do their job in educating their children in the true faith, and it all worked together.
Yeah. And that worked more or less until basically 1960 or so. Maybe a little bit later. But the Cultural Revolution in our country upturned everything, including Catholic education. Let's talk about what happened in the 60s, Father.
Well, of course, these congregations of women, which have been founded from the 1700s on, in a certain sense, they were wonderful. They were devout and they were effective, but they were not congregations that had a long history and long tradition. And if you in a new institution like that, relatively new in terms of church history, when some of the conditions changed that were assumed in the original foundation, there's not much context to form a judgment about what do we do now. This is a crisis of identity. Like, well, we were founded to be the whatever. I won't name any particular congregation, but the point is that our founders had certain ideas which were based upon the Catholic faith and piety of that time. But now none of this seems to be certain, and everything is up for question and dialogue and so on. And so many of these ladies became unstable in their vocations and left, and the parishes ended up being bereft of the schools that they had because they no longer had the religious sisters who could teach in them for very little.
Yes,
the parishes were faced with an immense economic burden.
Yes,
and I remember in the 70s pastors preaching vehemently about the necessity of supporting the school.
Yes,
and they did it in tones. The Irish pastors that I knew, they did it in tones which of sort of like outrage, because they never had to. This had never been an issue before.
Right, and
now it was something they had to be begging people to keep.
Yeah, what are we going to do? We don't want the school to close. What are we going to do?
And a lot of parents, they started sending their kids to public schools so that, at a certain point, the Catholic schools had to charge tuition, significant tuition, which they didn't have to do before. And so a majority of Catholic students ended up going to public schools, which is the state today.
The situation in my own family life growing up in the 70s and the 80s was that sort of just after the evacuation of the convents and the parish teaching sisters communities, every parish had the convent on the property, but most of those convents were empty. And there might have been one or two sisters left who were kind of hanging on.
Right.
Maybe they were the principal, but they were around, but not in the numbers they were 10 years prior to that. And so the women of the parish whose husbands were still working, whose children were mostly grown, maybe high school age children or out of the house, stepped in and started teaching for a pittance. They were paid, but they weren't paid much because the parish couldn't afford to pay them much. So you can imagine, well, here's a new workforce in Catholic education, mothers mostly, and that worked for maybe another 10 years.
They're not very durable, though, because you
no.
need to pay people. If you have lay people, you have to pay them a living salary.
That's exactly right. And the only reason they were able to do that was because their husbands were still in the workforce,
right,
and they were supporting the family with a regular salary. And these women, out of the generosity of their hearts, they loved the faith, they loved their parish, they loved the school because their own children went there, and they stepped into the fray. But by the middle of the 1980s, that was all starting to come apart at the seams.
One of the weaknesses of that system then was also that these were lay women and some men as well who were not formed as classic religious and were very much influenced by whatever the trends were in the church generally. And so they were not always catechetically as sound as what had preceded them.
Right. Not through any fault of their own.
No, not at all. But they were just affected the way all the laity were, and the clergy as well. But this is just history. It's not a critique of anybody. It's just what happens. And so that posed problems also because you got pretty practically ideologically convinced, ultra progressive stuff going on in a lot of Catholic schools.
Yes.
Liturgically, especially in terms of and in fact, an attitude of we don't do that stuff anymore, So the Baltimore Catechism went flying
door,
out the window,
yes.
you know,
Along with the communion rail and
communion rail and everything else. It was just part of
organ.
the general revolution
Right.
Of everything. And so that was one of the, even though the ladies stepped in, it wasn't a durable solution.